It all began with a body by the creek. It was a cold winter morning on January 11, 1994, when the peace of the small suburban town of Elmswood, Georgia, was shattered. The town, known for its close-knit community and tranquil atmosphere, suddenly became the center of a gruesome discovery. A local fisherman named Roy Mitchell, an old-timer who'd been living in Elmswood all his life, was out checking his traps along the winding Little Willow Creek just outside the woods. That's where he saw it. Something that, in all his 72 years, he wished he hadn't seen. The body lay partially submerged near the muddy embankment, tangled in the reeds and shrubs that clawed over the bank. It was a young woman. Her delicate features were barely visible beneath the thin layer of frost that had settled overnight. Her skin was pale, almost bluish, as if the life had been drained out of her entirely. She was positioned awkwardly, her arms spread as though reaching for something. She wore a crimson sweater which stood out starkly against the muted gray backdrop of winter, and dark jeans, still damp from the icy water that had partially claimed her body. Roy froze. For a moment he thought it was a mannequin, a prank or dumb joke someone had played near the creek. But as he stepped closer, the reality of what he saw hit him hard, like the sledgehammer he used to split wood. "God almighty," he muttered under his breath, taking off his worn cap and clutching it in trembling hands. His heart raced as he fumbled for the old rotary phone fixed to the back wall of his small fishing shack. When Sheriff Garrett Wilkes received the call from the frantic old fisherman, he didn't take it lightly. Elmswood wasn't the kind of town where these things happened. People left their doors unlocked, kids rode their bikes well past sunset, and the worst crime Wilkes typically dealt with was trespassing teenagers stealing a six-pack from Earl's gas station. A dead body in a creek? It sounded like something out of a crime show, not Elmswood. "Stay put, Roy," Wilkes instructed over the phone, his voice gruff yet controlled. "Don't touch the scene. We're on our way." The gray patrol car bounced along the winding dirt road leading to Little Willow Creek, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Garrett, alongside his young deputy Ellie Barnes, arrived at the scene minutes later. When they saw Roy standing at the creek's edge, pale-faced and visibly shaken, they knew whatever lay ahead wasn't going to be something they could just sweep under the rug. "What'd you find, Roy?" Garrett asked as he stepped out of the cruiser, his boots crunching on the frosty grass. Roy simply motioned toward the creek with a shaky hand. "I didn't touch her, Sheriff, just came up this morning to check the traps, you know, and there she was. Just laying there like that. Ain't right, ain't natural." His words trailed off as Garrett followed the line of his pointing finger, and there she was. Her lifeless form sent a chill up Garrett's spine, colder than the January air. He took a deep breath, steeling himself before moving closer. Deputy Barnes pulled out her notepad, her hands trembling slightly as she scribbled the time and location of the discovery. "She looks young, early 20s maybe," Barnes murmured, her voice barely audible. "There's no sign of struggle, no visible blood at least. Think she drowned?" Garrett shook his head slowly. "This ain't no accident," he replied, crouching closer to the body to look for clues. "There's no drag marks leading to the creek. Someone left her here. Placed her maybe to make it look like she fell in. But look at her neck." He pointed to faint reddish marks visible along the side of her throat, partially obscured by her blonde hair. Barnes winced. "Strangulation? Could be. Won't know for sure until the coroner takes a look." Garrett stood and exhaled, his breath a mist in the cold air. "Make a note of this. No bag, no purse, no ID, and check this. No shoes either. Whoever did this didn't just kill her. They wanted to erase her." The two officers worked methodically, securing the scene with yellow police tape and ensuring Roy stayed at a distance. As the sun crept higher into the sky, so did the curiosity of the townsfolk. News travels fast in a small town like Elmswood, especially when something this gruesome happens. By midday, a small crowd had gathered beyond the tape, murmuring in hushed tones about the girl in the creek. She was a stranger. None of the townsfolk recognized her, but that didn't stop the rumors from flying. "Could be one of those kids passing through town," an older woman muttered to her neighbor. "Or some runaway from the city," came another voice. "Betcha she got mixed up with the wrong crowd. That's what happens when the big city kids come out here." Little did they know, the answer to who she was, and who had taken her life, was far more sinister than they could have imagined. By the time the coroner arrived to collect the body, Garrett was already lost in thought. This wasn't just a tragic death, it was a puzzle. One with a million pieces scattered across the empty fields and darkened woods surrounding Elmswood, and something deep in his gut told him this wouldn't be the last body they found. "We've got work to do," Garrett said quietly, glancing at Barnes as the coroner's team carried the body away in a black bag. "A lot of work." The young deputy nodded, her determination masking the unease creeping up her spine. "Where do we start, Sheriff?" "Find out who she is. Start putting the pieces together." Garrett stared at the creek, now empty but still holding the weight of what they'd discovered. "Whoever did this didn't stop here. Mark my words, Ellie, this is just the beginning." And with that, the quiet town of Elmswood, Georgia, was forever changed. The string of disappearances that shook the town. In the weeks following the discovery of the young woman's body in Little Willow Creek, Elmswood was rocked by news that seemed stranger than fiction. A quiet unease hung over the town as the mystery deepened. At first it was whispers in local diners and church pews about the girl from the creek. No one in town seemed to know her, and outsiders rarely ventured into Elmswood unless they were passing through. But then, another headline hit the Elmswood Gazette. A local truck driver by the name of Marty Cooper was reported missing. Marty was a staple in the community, his olive green semi often parked along Main Street as he grabbed a meal at Rosie's Diner. When the news broke that Marty hadn't returned home after a cross-state delivery to Alabama, it sent a ripple of panic through the town. Sheriff Garrett Wilkes picked up the phone that morning, rubbing sleep from his tired eyes as the dispatcher relayed the call. "I'm telling you, Sheriff, Marty never just takes off like that. Something's gotta be wrong," said Linda Cooper, Marty's wife of 30 years, her voice cracking over the line. Garrett reassured her as best he could. "Linda, we'll look into it. I'll send deputies to follow his delivery route. You hang tight, okay?" But deep in his gut, Garrett's instincts told him it wasn't a simple case of a trucker losing track of time. He remembered the blonde girl by the creek, her lifeless body telling a story only a killer could know. Just 3 days later, another man disappeared. This time it was Brian Big Red Lancaster, a young mechanic who often worked late nights at his family's auto shop near Dalton Highway. His beat-up Ford pickup was found abandoned on the side of the road, the cab empty, but his tools left behind in the truck bed. "That boy wouldn't leave his snap-on wrenches behind for anything," muttered his father, Tom Lancaster, as Garrett examined the truck. "It's like someone snatched him right out of the driver's seat." The disappearances created an eerie pattern, all connecting back to the winding stretches of rural highways and back roads surrounding Elmswood. Garrett called in help from Deputy Barnes, who meticulously plotted the locations on a large county map spread out on the sheriff's office wall. "Look at this," Barnes said, circling each red X with her index finger. "They're all going missing along routes that cut through the forested areas, and none of them seem random. It's almost like the killers got their own hunting ground." Garrett nodded grimly. "The girl in the creek wasn't a one-off. Something's happening out there, something planned. Whoever's behind it knows how to cover their tracks and leave us spinning in circles." By the time the fourth disappearance hit the news, the townsfolk were bordering on hysteria. Parents kept their kids inside after dark, stores closed earlier than usual, and hardly anyone drove the county's lonely roads without locking their doors first. Local headlines screamed variations of the same chilling sentiment. Who's next? The fourth victim was a traveling salesman named Richard Givens, who left behind a wife and 3 kids. His last known stop was at a motel just outside Taylor's Ridge, where he had checked in but never checked out. The owner of the motel found nothing out of place in his room, no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, not even a hastily scrawled note. His car, however, was gone without a trace. The lack of evidence gnawed at Garrett and his team. Each case felt like chasing shadows in the dark, and the pressure only mounted when neighboring counties started reporting their own missing persons. Truckers, lone travelers, even a schoolteacher who was last spotted driving to visit her family in northern Alabama. "It's almost like a ghost took 'em," Deputy Barnes muttered one evening as she leaned back in her creaky chair at the station. "Not a ghost," Garrett replied bitterly. "A predator, a damn good one." As investigations deepened, some chilling consistencies began to emerge. The victims were primarily vehicle owners, drivers of trucks, SUVs, or sedans that could fetch a good price on the black market. And each of them was last seen traveling alone at night along isolated stretches of road. One trucker passing through Elmswood recounted an unsettling encounter over coffee at Rosie's Diner. "I was making my way to Savannah," he began, wiping his hands nervously on his jeans. "Just past midnight. There was this lady standing on the shoulder all by herself. She had a flat tire, or at least that's what it looked like. She waved me down, but something about it didn't sit right. It was like she wasn't panicked or nothing, just waiting." "You stop?" Garrett asked, his brow furrowed. "No, sir," the man said quickly, shaking his head. "I've been on the road long enough to know some setups ain't worth the risk. Drove right past her, but I swear I seen two more figures just out of the corner of my eye standing by the tree line." The sheriff leaned back and rubbed his temple. It was starting to make sense. These weren't isolated incidents. They were traps laid by someone clever enough to exploit the kindness or vulnerability of their victims. Meanwhile, the town's residents grew increasingly restless. Churches held nightly prayer vigils and rumors started spreading like wildfire. Was there a serial killer stalking the highways? A gang preying on unsuspecting travelers? Some folks whispered it was a hatchet-wielding drifter who had escaped from an asylum, while others coined the term highway phantom to describe the unseen predator. "I tell ya," barked Carl Johnson, a hot-headed regular at Earl's gas station, "the sheriff's department ain't doing jack. We should be out there armed, hunting this bastard ourselves." Garrett heard it all, bore the brunt of the town's frustration, while piecing together a picture that still had too many missing pieces. With every lead that fizzled out, the weight on his shoulders grew heavier. The turning point came when a trucker named Danny Blue Matthews managed to escape. He barreled into the sheriff's station in his rig, his face pale and his hands shaking so bad he could barely sign the incident report. "You have no idea," he kept muttering. "They came out of nowhere, blocked the whole damn road. And that woman, Jesus, I thought she was gonna pull a gun on me." With Blue's detailed account, Garrett and his team began to close in on what they hoped was the group responsible. They didn't have names yet, but they had something almost as good: a method. The predators were setting up roadside traps under the guise of needing help, and while their motives seemed to be tied to car theft, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling there was something darker underlying it all. "The girl in the creek," he said aloud one evening, pacing the floor of the station. "She wasn't alone in this. She was the first piece on the board. And if we don't find out who's playing this game, there's gonna be a hell of a lot more missing faces on that map." And so, the hunt for answers continued, as both the town of Elmswood and the surrounding counties began waiting, holding their breath for the next disappearance, or for the menacing truth to finally emerge from the shadows. A scene full of questions. In the early hours of dawn one chilly February morning, the serene outskirts of Elmswood erupted in another round of chaos. It wasn't long after the town had learned of the missing truck driver, Marty Cooper, when yet another troubling discovery forced its way into the headlines. This time it was a body, a man's body, found near the entrance of an old abandoned sawmill just off Route 17, a stretch of road notorious for its eerie desolation. The call came from Dan Atwood, owner of the small gas station that sat just a half-mile away from the sawmill. Dan had been feeding stray cats by the dumpsters when he caught a whiff of something that didn't belong. It was a smell everyone knew but prayed they'd never encounter, a stench deep and metallic, clinging to the cold air like a bad memory. When Sheriff Garrett Wilkes arrived on the scene with Deputy Ellie Barnes, the morning mist still hung low over the fields, wrapping the sawmill in an almost ghostly haze. The weathered wooden frame of the building towered above like a menacing specter from another time, its roof buckling and half caved in. Out front, ringing the gravel drive, were the unmistakable marks of tires, large, rugged prints that told their own part of the story. The body itself was sprawled across the dirt, legs awkwardly bent, fingers twisted as if gripping for purchase. Blood pooled beneath the head, staining the frosted ground. The victim, a middle-aged man in a plaid jacket and jeans, looked as though he'd been violently thrown from his vehicle, or dragged after death. His face was battered beyond recognition, but what caught Garrett's eye wasn't the mess of injuries. It was the peculiar position of the man's hands. Both arms reached upward, his fingers frozen mid-curl as if he'd been trying to shield himself from something, or someone. "Sweet Jesus," Deputy Barnes muttered quietly, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck as she crouched next to Garrett. "This is worse than I was imagining." Garrett nodded grimly, his ice-flecked breath hanging in the air. He scanned the surrounding area, the thick forest pressing in tight on all sides. "No wallet, no keys, no ID, figures, same as the others." He glanced at Barnes. "This guy was left here just like the girl from the creek, like trash someone didn't bother to clean up." "What do you make of the tire marks?" Barnes asked, pointing to the deep grooves in the gravel leading away from the sawmill. Garrett stood, motioning her toward a set of uneven, overlapping prints that curved erratically around the site. "Look at that, 2 different sets of tracks. One, here." He gestured toward the freshest indents. "Big, maybe a pickup truck or a van. And then those there. They're older, overlapping like someone left another set during a previous trip." Barnes tilted her head, cradling her notepad. So you're thinking they came back? What, dropped him here in the middle of the night? Garrett remained silent for a beat, his eyes locking on the rotting planks of the sawmill's front porch. Something about the structure seemed off, the weight of its history pressing against his chest like a bad omen. He finally nodded. Either they were dumping him or... He trailed off, not wanting to speak the other possibility aloud. Or what? Barnes pressed, scribbling furiously. Or this spot's more than just convenient, he replied. Could be it means something to whoever's behind this, could be a ritual thing. The thought hung in the air like a vulture circling carrion. As the investigation continued, photographers snapped shots of the scene, the forensic team carefully working around the body without disturbing the tracks. Muffled voices floated through the damp morning as officers scoured the area, boots crunching through patches of frost. Then one of the techs called out, her voice tight with alarm. "Sheriff! We've got something over here!" Garrett turned sharply, making his way to where Lily Johnston, one of the team's more experienced forensic specialists, was standing on the far side of a rusted chain-link fence that bordered the property line. She pointed to what could only be described as intentional markers. Branches arranged in a crude triangle formation, their tips charred black as though burned. Within the triangle, the grass was dead and brittle, despite the rest of the ground being damp and frozen. "What the hell is this supposed to be?" Garrett asked, leaning in closer. "Some kind of symbol?" Barnes offered, frowning as she attempted to make sense of the strange display. "Could be," Lily replied, crouching to inspect the area. "It's deliberate, Sheriff. You don't get dead grass like this naturally, not this isolated. It's been chemically treated or burned. And these branches, they weren't just dropped here by the wind, someone put them here for a reason." Barnes swore under her breath. "What are they trying to say? It's not like we're gonna figure this all out from a campfire ritual." Garrett remained silent, his eyes scanning the area once more. Beyond the triangle, his gaze lingered on a small object glinting in the sunlight, half buried in the dirt. The sheriff reached down and plucked it from the earth, a small metallic pin, no longer than a dime, with a faded red stripe running across the top. "What have you got there?" Barnes asked, squinting at the pin. "Military insignia," Garrett said, his voice trailing off as memories pulled him elsewhere. "Army Supply Division, maybe? Vietnam era?" The weight of what Garrett held in his hand suddenly felt heavier than its actual mass. If someone connected to the military was behind this, it added a chilling layer of complexity to their case. But why leave something like this behind? Was it an accident, or a taunt? "This just keeps getting weirder," Barnes muttered, running a gloved hand through her windswept hair. "That's one way to put it," Garrett replied. His tone was steady, but Barnes could hear the frustration bubbling beneath. "We've got two things clear now. Whoever this is, they're sending us breadcrumbs. And they're not just killing for sport. There's a method to this madness." As the team packed up evidence and called in the coroner to remove the body, Garrett remained by the edge of the sawmill's porch, staring into the sprawling woods beyond. Somewhere out there, he knew, someone was watching, planning their next move. And for the first time in his long career, Garrett Wilkes felt something he hadn't in decades. Genuine fear. Did this deliver the eerie, suspense-filled storytelling you wanted? I aimed to build tension and add depth to the scene while introducing new elements to pull the narrative forward. Let me know if you'd like more added or a different tone. The secret weapon, women as bait. For weeks, the investigation had hit nothing but dead ends. Despite the growing body count and an increasingly panicked public, every lead Sheriff Garrett Wilkes and his team followed seemed to wither on the vine. But a chilling pattern was beginning to emerge, one that sent shivers through the team as they pieced it together bit by agonizing bit. It came down to one word: women. It started with a disturbing account from Charlie Benson, a trucker who had narrowly escaped an encounter the night before Christmas. He'd stopped by the sheriff's station one frosty morning, still visibly shaken, his face pale as he nursed the edges of his coffee mug with trembling hands. She was pretty, short blonde hair, leather jacket, jeans that looked spray-painted on, Charlie said in a low voice, glancing nervously at the few deputies loitering nearby. I was driving east down Route 17 real late, maybe 1 a.m., there she was, leaning on the hood like she'd been there for hours. Hood was popped open like her car broke down. He shifted in his seat, avoiding Garrett's intense gaze. I pulled over, you know. She looked harmless. There was snow blowing around and she wasn't even wearing gloves. Who leaves a girl out there in the middle of the night like that? He paused, shaking his head as if telling himself he should have known better. Garrett leaned in. What happened next, Charlie? Charlie swallowed hard. She smiled at me, Sheriff, sort of cocked her head like she knew already I'd fall for it, asked if I had jumper cables. She seemed off, though. Too calm, like it wasn't really about starting the car. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. That's when I saw him. Garrett stiffened in his chair. Saw who? There was a shadow, Charlie said, his eyes darting toward the window. By the tree line. Big guy. I mean, he was just standing there, still as a damn scarecrow, watching. Gave me goosebumps from my boots to my neck. Charlie dragged his hand down his face and exhaled. I got spooked, Sheriff. Real spooked. Told her I could call for help instead. And she just stared at me. Didn't say nothing. I swear I heard something move behind me too, like crunching in the snow. That's when I got the hell out of there. The sheriff mulled over Charlie's story for a moment, his gut churning. And the woman? Did she follow you? Say anything? No, sir, she just stood there watching. But the way she looked at me as I drove off, like I ruined her damn night, Charlie said, gripping the coffee mug tightly. I'll never stop for someone like that again. Never. This incident was the first clue that led Garrett to suspect the killers were playing a long, calculated game. Someone out there was using vulnerable-looking women to lure unsuspecting Good Samaritans into a trap. But it wasn't until 2 days later, when another trucker recounted a similar story, that the pieces began to fall into place. Danny Blue Matthews described the same woman, distinct features resembling those Charlie had described, but with one major twist that left the room silent. She offered me a cigarette when I stopped, Blue recalled, lighting up his own like it was his lifeline. Said her boyfriend had gone to get help but hadn't come back. When I mentioned her fingerprints might freeze messing with the car engine, she laughed. Laughed? Barnes asked, raising an eyebrow. Blue nodded grimly. Not a nervous laugh. It was, I don't know, like I told the punchline to her private joke. That's when I realized how odd it felt, the whole thing. That ain't a stranded car. She barely knew how to hold the wrench she was poking around with, and no dirt under her nails. What the hell kind of road warrior doesn't get their hands dirty? I drove off when I saw someone move behind the car, saw him just barely in the rearview mirror. It was the second near miss in as many weeks, leaving Garrett convinced they were dealing with more than just your run-of-the-mill highway drifters. He pushed his chair back and paced the room. We're not dealing with amateurs here, Garrett said, his voice steady but grim. This group, whoever they are, they're playing it smart. They're using the oldest trick in the book. They're using women to bait the hook, and then they reel them in for the kill. As chilling as the theory was, it made sense. Most of the victims had been traveling alone at night. They were lone drivers, disconnected from others, the type who might not be missed right away. Garrett gestured to Barnes, who was leaning over a map dotted with pins and red strings like a chaotic web. Start cross-referencing the victims' routes, Garrett ordered. If these women are stationing themselves somewhere, we need to figure out where they're operating. But tracing such a mobile and coordinated group proved nearly impossible. Each encounter was fleeting. Each victim or near victim described the women differently, sometimes blonde, sometimes brunette, always dressed just provocatively enough to play the role of damsel in distress. I'll bet my badge they've got more than one woman running this setup, Barnes said, tacking another pin onto the map. Garrett nodded grimly. And the men, he muttered. They're the ones lying in wait. These women, they're just the front line. Someone else is pulling the strings. Things escalated when the FBI got wind of the situation. A profiler from the Behavioral Science Unit confirmed what Garrett had feared all along. Classic predator behavior, the FBI agent said during their briefing. They're exploiting kindness, specifically targeting men who are more likely to stop for a woman in need. The setup is almost always the same. Subtle distress signals, appealing to familiarity or lust, followed by an ambush. These women, they're not just bait, they're part of the team, and they're damn good at what they do. The agent paused, scanning the room of tense officers. These roads, they're their hunting ground, and they're not stopping until we bring them down. Later that evening, Garrett stood in the empty precinct, staring at the fraying strings connecting the victims' last known locations on the map. The pattern was clear now. The killers were circling Elmswood like vultures, preying on its outskirts while staying mobile enough to avoid detection. Pulling his coat tight, Garrett muttered to himself, if they're hunting here, we're gonna turn the tables. Let's see how they like being the prey. What do you think? I aim to dive deep into the psychological game at play, giving the whole operation of using women as bait a layered, sinister feel while driving the investigation element forward. Let me know. The clue from tire tracks and a key witness. The break came on an overcast Thursday evening. Sheriff Garrett Wilkes had been mulling over the map on the precinct wall for hours. the bright red pins marking the disappearances creating a grim mosaic. His coffee had long since gone cold, and the weight of unanswered questions hung as heavy as the low clouds outside. That's when the call came in. "Sheriff, we've got a survivor," Deputy Ellie Barnes announced as she burst into his office out of breath and clutching her notepad. "It's big! He says he saw them, all of them!" Garrett straightened in his chair, his blood turning cold but his mind sharpening instantly. "Who is it? Where is he now?" "Name's Marcus Lane," Barnes replied quickly. "Truck driver, mid-30s. He's out at County General getting stitched up, but Doc says he's coherent enough to talk. He made it out alive, Garrett. He was attacked last night on Highway 19, just 2 miles from the sawmill." Without a word, Garrett grabbed his coat, and within minutes they were on the road. His patrol car sliced through the thin drizzle that had begun to fall, its tires hissing along the wet asphalt. When they arrived at the hospital room, Marcus Lane was sitting up in bed, his face pale against the white pillow. His arm was in a sling, and a bandage marred his forehead, the edges tinged with dried blood. His eyes darted nervously to the open doorway as Garrett and Barnes stepped in. "Mr. Lane," Garrett started, softening his tone as much as his deep, gravelly voice would allow. "I'm Sheriff Wilkes. This here is Deputy Barnes. We've been looking into the disappearances in these parts, and we understand you've been through hell. First of all, we're real glad you're all right." Marcus nodded slowly, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Yeah, all right. Guess you could say that. I reckon I'm lucky to even be here." Garrett pulled up a chair, settling himself just a few feet from Marcus. "Marcus, what happened out there? Take your time. Just walk us through everything you remember." Marcus took a shaky breath, his hand twitching slightly as it rested on the hospital blanket. "It was late, maybe close to midnight. I had just passed the county line heading south and the road was empty. Dark as hell out there except for my brights. That's when I saw it. A car sitting on the shoulder with its hazards on, maybe 40 yards ahead. Figured someone needed help." Garrett leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of car? Did you catch the make or color?" "It was an old sedan," Marcus replied. "Kinda beat up, dark blue maybe. Didn't pay much attention to the model at first. Just saw the hazards blinking in the dark. As I got closer, I saw her, this young woman, blonde hair, waving me down. She was standing on the passenger side, pointing toward the hood like it was stalled." "Did you stop?" Barnes asked, jotting furiously in her notebook. Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window as if he were reliving the moment. Yeah, I stopped. I mean, she looked scared and it was cold as hell out. Who's gonna leave someone out there like that?" He swallowed hard, his voice dropping. "I should have known better." Garrett's gaze hardened, though his voice remained calm. "What happened when you stopped?" Marcus exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his blanket. "I pulled over and stepped out with my flashlight. She looked real jittery, kept glancing over her shoulder. I asked if she needed a ride or a jump or something, but she just muttered something about a flat tire. That's when I noticed—" He paused, his expression darkening. "Noticed what?" Garrett pressed. Marcus's knuckles whitened as he clenched the blanket tighter. "She wasn't wearing gloves. I know that sounds stupid, but it was freezing out there, and her hands didn't look cold. They looked still, like she didn't even care about the weather." He shook his head. "It gave me chills." Marcus glanced back at them, his voice trembling now. "That's when I turned around to grab my tire iron and I saw it. The shadow. A guy, big as a damn linebacker, coming at me from the back of my rig. He must have been hiding there the whole time, waiting. Another guy came out of the trees on the other side. They were fast, Sheriff. Too damn fast." Barnes froze, her pen hovering over the notepad. "2 of them?" "3, Marcus corrected. "The third one was standing by the tree line, holding something. Looked like a shotgun maybe, but he didn't even move. He was just watching, like he was in charge or something." Garrett's face tightened. "And the woman?" "She backed up real quick, didn't even say a word. Just stood there while the first guy swung at me with a crowbar. I ducked, but they had me cornered. One of them got my arm, knocked me flat on the ground. I thought I was done for." Marcus's voice cracked as he continued. "But then the idiot stumbled on the ice, gave me enough time to crawl back around and grab the wrench in my cab. Swung it at the big one's face and ran like hell." "You made it to your truck?" Garrett asked. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, barely. Peeled out of there before they could catch me, but not before I saw their truck, partially hidden behind the trees, an old red pickup, big tires, covered in mud." Barnes perked up at that, scribbling furiously. "Did you catch plates, or anything distinctive?" "The windshield had a crack," Marcus muttered, "right across the passenger side, like somebody tried to fix it, but it spread anyway." Garrett leaned back, his mind racing. The old red truck with mud tires could match the tracks they'd found near the sawmill. It was a connection, one of their first solid ones. "One last thing, Marcus," Garrett asked quietly. "You saw their faces?" Marcus hesitated, the fear in his eyes evident. "Not really. The big one had a ski mask, but I saw something on the second guy, a tattoo right on his neck. Looked like a snake, or maybe flames. I couldn't tell." Garrett stood, his jaw tight as he exchanged a glance with Barnes. "You've been a big help, Marcus. We're gonna find him." As Garrett and Barnes left the hospital, the pieces were finally beginning to take shape. Marcus's testimony not only gave them the description of the suspect's vehicle but proved one chilling fact. The attackers weren't acting out of desperation. They were organized, calculated, and they weren't working alone. Garrett stopped by the patrol car, his breath visible in the cold night. "Ellie, send out a bolo on that red truck. Check repair shops in town, especially any with records of fractured windshields." He stared out at the foggy highway ahead. "I want these bastards before they strike again. What do you think?" I aimed for suspenseful, vivid imagery while building tension and providing critical narrative details to push the story forward. Let me know if you want more. The Night Hunters. Killers without mercy. The deeper Sheriff Garrett Wilkes and his team dug into the unsettling case, the more they began to unravel the twisted web of an underground organization. A ruthless gang calling themselves the Night Hunters. Their name didn't pop up on official records, not at first anyway. No police reports or local gossip had ever hinted at such a group operating in or around rural Georgia. But if the evidence and Marcus Lane's testimony were any indication, the Night Hunters weren't ordinary criminals. They were meticulous, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. It wasn't until a tip-off from a nearby county's deputy that the name surfaced in the investigation. "We've been trying to pin down that crew for years," the deputy admitted during a phone call with Garrett. "They operate out of the shadows, barely leave behind anything other than bodies and stolen vehicles. Some folks say they ain't even a gang, that they're something worse, like a cult. But yeah, locals in Alabama call them the Night Hunters." For Garrett, nothing about this group felt random. Every piece of evidence pointed to a deliberate, calculated operation. The tire tracks, Marcus Lane's barely escaped ambush, and the trail of victims who vanished without a trace. The dots started connecting, revealing a picture more sinister than anyone in Elmswood could have imagined. "They're predators," Garrett said during an impromptu meeting in the station with his team and an FBI profiler brought in to assist. "Whatever they're doing out there, they're treating these roads like their hunting ground. Any driver who fits their target profile gets lured in, ambushed, and taken out. Some are killed outright, well, we don't know where the hell they end up. It's almost military the way they operate, precise and synchronized." The profiler, a hollow-eyed man in his late 40s named Agent Donner, nodded. "This kind of organization isn't your average street gang. They're organized crime, and from the few survivors' accounts, there's a hierarchy. Whoever's at the top, they run this thing like a business. The women play the bait. We've seen this tactic before, but the heavy hitters, the ones who strike, they're the enforcers, and they answer to a single leader." "Right, but who the hell is the leader?" Barnes asked, her voice sharpened by frustration. Donner flipped open a thin FBI folder and laid out a photograph grainy from poor lighting, but the figure was unmistakable. A broad-shouldered man with graying hair tied back into a ponytail, and a hard, angular face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. "That's Lawrence Larry Cole," Donner said, tapping the image with his pen. "Former Army, dishonorably discharged. And before you get to wondering why, no, it wasn't for anything petty like insubordination. This guy has a history, a paper trail of violent incidents swept under the rug during his service overseas." Garrett's eyes remained locked on the photo as Donner continued. "He served in Vietnam, special operations. Think sabotage missions behind enemy lines. He learned how to take apart vehicles in minutes, dismantle supply chains, and even stage fake accidents to bait enemies into traps. After the war, he didn't come back to settle down with a picket fence and 2 kids. Instead, he started running jobs for various crime networks in the South. Robbery, extortion, arms running. Word is he grew more violent over the years, carving out a reputation as someone who didn't just finish the job but did so with a sense of vengeance. All that to say, if he's leading a group like the Night Hunters, it's bad news." Barnes frowned. "And why the Night Hunters? What's their angle? Is this really just about boosting cars?" Donner shrugged slightly. "Cars are the currency, sure. They steal, strip them for parts or sell them outright and use the cash to fund whatever backroom operations Larry's cooking up. But from what our intel suggests, he's not above killing for sport. He gets into his targets' heads, makes them feel cornered, hopeless. That's part of their MO. They don't just kill, they send a message. You're prey. We're predators. To them, humans wandering lonely roads at night are like animals crossing into the wrong territory. And Larry? He's the one holding the rifle. The room fell silent as the weight of the information settled in. Garrett finally broke the silence, his voice hard as steel. So we're not just dealing with thrill-seekers. We've got ex-military psychos playing war games on these roads, using decoys and ambush tactics. And worst of all, they think they're unstoppable. It's worse than that, Donner said quietly. They've been getting away with this for years. I've seen notes from other counties that had similar disappearances reported. Trucks abandoned, tire marks near wooded areas, traces of stolen vehicles moving out of state. But cops can't pin them because they work across jurisdictions. They're ghosts. Ghosts, maybe. But Garrett knew ghosts didn't leave tire tracks or bodies behind. The sheriff slammed his palm against the map on the wall, his finger hovering over the location of Little Willow Creek. It all starts here, he muttered. The girl in the creek. She wasn't random. She wasn't just a victim. She was part of this. Barnes exchanged a nervous glance with Donner. You think she was one of their bait girls? Maybe, Garrett said, his brow dark with thought. But if she was, they didn't just leave her there to make a clean getaway. Maybe her death wasn't part of their original plan. Something went sideways, caused them to dump her. Donner crossed his arms, leaning against the desk. If she was one of their members, it's possible she was expendable. Larry doesn't seem like the kind of guy who tolerates mistakes, and if one of the bait girls stepped out of line... He didn't finish the thought, but Garrett didn't need him to. The realization hit hard. This gang didn't just prey on outsiders. They kept their own members living in fear. Every one of those young women used as bait for their schemes knew they were as disposable as the victims they lured to their deaths. I want eyes on every highway and back road within 50 miles, Garrett said firmly, pushing back the growing tightness in his chest. Get local patrols, state troopers, whoever you can, pull reports of stolen vehicles, missing persons cases, hell, I don't care if it means checking pawn shops for spare parts. If these bastards are still in the area, we'll flush them out. Donner nodded but looked skeptical. They'll be expecting us, Sheriff. This is a game to them. It's how they survive. Garrett glanced back at the worn photograph of Larry Cole. Then we stopped playing by their rules. What do you think? I aimed to capture the escalating tension, adding backstory and gritty realism to make the Night Hunters feel like a chilling professional operation. Let me know if you'd like even more layers to it. The profile of the leader, the infamous killer. When it came to the horrifying efficiency of the Night Hunters, there was no doubt that this wasn't the work of petty criminals or a ragtag gang operating by chance. No, this was deliberate, strategic, and deeply sinister. At the center of it all stood a man who cast a dark shadow over the investigation, Lawrence Larry Cole. The dossier on Larry Cole wasn't thick, but what was in it was enough to unsettle even the most hardened investigators. The name carried a reputation that stretched back decades, and the more Garrett Wilkes read through the details, the more his stomach churned. First of all, let's get one thing straight, Agent Donner began as he laid out the photos and reports on the precinct conference table. You're not dealing with just any ex-military type here. Lawrence Cole is one of the most dangerous men the South has ever produced, not just for the lives he's taken, but for how he takes them. Garrett studied the grainy photograph plastered across one of the documents. It showed a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair tied back into a ponytail. His angular face was craggy and weathered, like a stone that had been eroded by decades of storms. There was nothing overtly remarkable about the image at first glance except for one detail: Larry's eyes. They were cold, lifeless, like two dull coins buried under years of cruelty and bloodshed. Let me guess, Garrett said, leaning back in his chair. Special Forces? Vietnam War? Agent Donner nodded. Exactly. He served 3 tours in Vietnam, most of that time spent in special operations. Charlie Company, long-range reconnaissance patrols, behind enemy lines kind of stuff, sabotage, ambushes, psychological warfare. This guy didn't just survive in the jungle, he thrived. Barnes, sitting across from Garrett, flipped through the pages of Larry's file. Psychological warfare? What, like creepy messages scrawled on walls or something? Donner's expression turned grim. Try fake accidents, luring entire enemy platoons to their deaths with staged scenes. He was known for setting up traps so clean, so believable that even seasoned soldiers said it felt like walking into a nightmare. This guy could dismantle a vehicle in the time it would take you to tie your boots, set up an ambush site, and vanish before anyone even realized what was happening. Garrett's jaw tightened. And they discharged him? With honors at first, Donner said, folding his arms. But the stories started leaking out. Turns out Larry didn't differentiate much between enemies and anyone who got in his way. A few incidents were hushed up, civilians that disappeared, locals who were interrogated and never seen again. Command probably thought they could bury it, but after the war, it all haunted him. Larry didn't just walk away from the shadows. Donner tapped the photo. He brought the darkness home with him. Great, Barnes muttered. So now we've got a trained killer with a god complex running a roadside death squad. That's putting it lightly, Donner replied. The guy didn't adjust well to civilian life, if you can even call it a life. After Vietnam, he floated between the South's underbelly, arms trafficking, drug running, black market auto theft. You name it, he was involved. But Larry wasn't just a hired thug, he built himself a network, one loyal enough to follow him to hell and back, and he ran it like a military unit. Barnes glanced through the thick report in front of her. What's his motive? Why do all this? The traps, the killing? It can't just be about stealing cars. Donner sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. That's the part we're still trying to piece together. Larry's actions have always been twofold. Sure, he's funding his operation. Cars are stripped for parts, resold, and keep the cash flowing. But the way he's operating, it's more personal. He treats every victim like prey, like a target he needs to conquer. To him, this is warfare. It's not about profit so much as proving his dominance. Dominance to who? His damn ego? Garrett snapped, his frustration boiling over. Donner nodded slightly. Partly, but it's also to maintain control over his crew. Larry's built his reputation not just as the leader of the Night Hunters, but as a figure to be feared. Nothing solidifies loyalty like terrifying your subordinates into submission. If even one bait girl, one enforcer, steps out of line, he makes an example of them. Garrett felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. His mind flashed back to the girl they'd found in Little Willow Creek. The girl, he muttered aloud, almost to himself. What girl? Donner asked. The one we found in the creek, Garrett replied, his voice low but firm. We thought she might have been one of their first victims, but now I'm starting to think she wasn't a victim at all, not in the way we first believed. Barnes's eyes widened as the realization hit. You mean she was one of theirs? Garrett nodded grimly. It makes sense. What if she was one of the bait girls and something went wrong? Maybe she failed to deliver her target, or maybe she tried to leave. Larry doesn't strike me as the forgiving type. Donner leaned back in his chair, folding his arms again. It's possible. Larry's known for being ruthless. If she broke ranks or became a liability, dumping her wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. A warning to anyone else who thought about defying him. The room fell silent as the weight of the idea settled over the table like a thick fog. Larry Cole isn't just a criminal, Garrett said finally, his voice laced with both anger and resolve. He's a damn warlord, and if we don't stop him, he's going to keep treating these roads like his battleground because to him that's exactly what they are. Donner's face darkened. Stopping him won't be simple. The Night Hunters work like a well-oiled machine. From the bait women to the enforcers to the crew stripping stolen vehicles, they're all part of the same beast, and it's Larry holding the leash. Garrett crossed his arms and stared at the map on the wall, the red pins that marked the areas of attack forming a chillingly precise spiral. Every road, every disappearance, every attack, it all came back to Larry Cole. I don't care what it takes, Garrett said, his voice low and steady. We find Larry and we bring him in. Dead or alive. Barnes sat back and shook her head slightly, processing the gravity of the situation. This isn't going to end in a courtroom, is it? Garrett locked eyes with her, his face unflinching. Not with a guy like Larry. Men like him don't go quietly. What do you think? I aimed to deepen the psychological tension and flesh out Larry Cole's villainous profile, making him the kind of iconic, menacing leader that keeps a story gripping. Let me know if you'd like it expanded even further. A catastrophic mistake. The downfall of even the most cunning predators often begins with one moment of overconfidence. A mistake so small it's almost unnoticeable until it unravels everything. For the Night Hunters, that moment came on a stormy night when they chose the wrong victim. It started like any other ambush. A lone vehicle made its way down a dark, winding road just past midnight. Rain pounded on the asphalt and the headlights barely cut through the sheets of water. The car, a gray sedan that blended into the night, was driven by a man who appeared to fit the hunter's preferred target profile. Solo traveler, middle-aged, seemingly unaware of the dangers lurking in the shadows. On the side of the road, one of the bait girls waited. She stood by a rusted station wagon with its hood propped open, the engine conveniently broken down. She was perfect. Blonde hair plastered to her face by the rain, mascara running just enough to give her an air of desperation. She clutched her jacket tight against her body, shivering in the cold, a picture of helplessness. As the gray sedan slowed to a crawl, its driver hesitating before finally pulling over, the bait girl stepped forward into the beam of the headlights, waving him down. Her face twisted into an expression of gratitude, relief. It was a performance she'd delivered countless times. But this time, she didn't know who she was dealing with. The man inside the sedan wasn't just another unfortunate Good Samaritan, his name was Agent Paul Reynolds, and he'd spent the last 8 months working undercover for the FBI's task force on organized crime. What the night hunters didn't realize was that Reynolds had been using himself as bait, tracking reports of similar roadside ambushes across state lines. The gray sedan wasn't just a get-me-around car, it was equipped with a hidden GPS locator, a dashcam streaming live footage back to FBI headquarters, and a handgun tucked securely in the glove box. Reynolds played his part perfectly. As he rolled his window down, his face registered just the right amount of concern. "You all right, miss? That's some nasty weather to be out in." The bait girl sniffled, her voice trembling. "Oh, thank God you stopped. My car just died and my boyfriend went to get help, but he's been gone for over an hour. I didn't know what to do." Her act might have fooled anyone else, but Reynolds' trained eye picked up the cracks in her story almost instantly. The car's tires were caked with fresh mud, not the kind that builds up after sitting idle for an hour. The hood was open, but there wasn't a single tool or sign of tampering, definitely no attempt at fixing anything. And then there was her body language. She wasn't nervous. There was no real fear in her eyes, just the calm calculation of someone who had done this before. Still, he played along, opening the door and stepping out into the pouring rain. "Let's take a look," he said, motioning toward the engine. She stepped aside, her movements fluid but hesitant as if she was stalling. That's when he caught it, a faint flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. The shadows in the nearby tree line shifted. They weren't alone. Reynolds nodded grimly to himself, his pulse quickening. This was it. They'd taken the bait, but not in the way they had planned. Just as he turned toward the engine, it happened. The first attacker, a hulking figure in a rain-soaked jacket, emerged from the trees, a crowbar glinting in his hand. Reynolds had seconds to pivot, draw his sidearm, and fire off a warning shot into the air. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the night, cutting through the sound of the rain like a lightning strike. The bait girl froze, her hands raised instinctively, panic flashing across her face. The second attacker, who had been creeping along the passenger side of the sedan, ducked back into the bushes. "FBI, put it down!" Reynolds barked, his voice thunderous as he leveled his gun at the first attacker. But these weren't amateurs. The man with the crowbar didn't flinch. Instead, he lunged forward, forcing Reynolds to fire a second shot, this time square into the man's shoulder. He dropped to the ground with a scream, clutching the wound as blood seeped through his jacket. The chaos escalated in an instant. The bait girl darted toward the station wagon, screaming something unintelligible into the darkness. Reynolds barely had time to process her words before he saw the station wagon's headlights flare to life. The engine roared as the vehicle accelerated toward him. Reynolds dove aside just in time, hitting the slick pavement hard as the station wagon sped past, its tires kicking up a spray of rainwater. The second attacker was gone, disappearing into the night with the bait girl. But they had made a critical error. In their scramble to escape, they abandoned the injured man behind. Within minutes, backup arrived. The sheriff's team, along with FBI agents, swarmed the scene. The injured attacker, writhing in pain and unable to resist, was hauled into custody. His arrest was a godsend for the investigation. Under pressure, and faced with the undeniable reality of spending the rest of his life in prison, the man began to talk. He wasn't high-ranking, but he knew enough to give them leads. Safe houses, vehicle drop points, and even a few names. Slowly but surely, the tangled web of the night hunters began to unravel. The GPS locator in Reynolds' sedan also played a crucial role. It confirmed the location of several drop sites the night hunters had been using, including a remote warehouse on the outskirts of Alabama. It was there, they suspected, the gang was hiding their stockpiled stolen vehicles, and possibly even Larry Cole himself. Garrett Wilkes stood by Reynolds' side near the wrecked sedan later that night, his jaw tight with determination. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the weight of what had just transpired lingered heavy in the air. "Well," Garrett said, adjusting his soaked hat, "I'd say that was one hell of a shortcut to breaking this wide open." Reynolds smirked, rubbing the shoulder he'd bruised during the dive. "Didn't plan on it going quite this way, Sheriff." But yeah, I'd say we've got him on the run now. Garrett nodded, staring into the darkness of the highway ahead. They made a mistake leaving us breadcrumbs, and now we're going to use every single one of them to light a fire under their operation. They picked the wrong guy to mess with tonight. The explosive raid. It had taken weeks to pull all the pieces together, each clue carefully extracted from the cryptic testimony of those who dared to speak out against the Night Hunter's reign of terror. From Marcus Lane's narrow escape to the GPS pings leading to hidden stash houses, it all pointed to one location, a forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of Black Oak, Alabama. Locals whispered about the place in hushed tones like it was cursed. Surrounded by dense woods and crumbling under years of disrepair, the warehouse was far enough from civilization to be used as a fortress for thieves, but close enough to the local highways for quick getaways. As storm clouds rolled in over Black Oak, Sheriff Garrett Wilkes stood beside FBI agent Paul Reynolds on a muddy dirt road that led straight to the Night Hunter's hideout. Overhead, lightning streaked once, illuminating the jagged outlines of the treetops. The air was thick with tension. This was it, the endgame. "They know we're coming," Garrett muttered under his breath, tightening the hold on the shotgun slung over his shoulder. Despite the calm tone in his voice, his hand trembled slightly. "You don't survive this long without being ready for a fight." Reynolds nodded, his jaw clenched as he scanned the forest surrounding them. "Oh, they're ready, but I don't think they're ready for us." He motioned toward a convoy of SUVs and armored vehicles parked around them. FBI SWAT teams milled in silence, strapping on tactical gear and triple-checking their weapons. This wasn't just a raid, it was a war zone waiting to erupt. Garrett turned toward his deputies who stood a few yards away under the dim glow of floodlights. Among them was Deputy Ellie Barnes, who wiped rain from her aviator glasses and tugged her bulletproof vest into place. Garrett could see the determination in her eyes, but he could also sense the weight of it all. Most of these officers had never faced anything like this. "All right, listen up," Garrett called out, his voice cutting through the drumming rain. "This ain't gonna be like pulling speeders over on Route 19. We're going in hard and fast, and we're taking these bastards down. Do not," he emphasized the word, his eyes narrowing, "do not let your guard down for a second. These are stone-cold killers. They'll chew you up and spit you out if you give them half a chance." Barnes stepped up beside him, her notepad replaced by an AR-15. "If Larry Cole's in there, you think he runs or fights?" Garrett didn't blink. "He'll fight. But he's not walking out of here tonight, not alive." Agent Reynolds raised a hand. "We've got confirmation of at least 15 hostiles inside, armed with heavy weapons. We've also identified vehicle bays, likely where they're storing stripped cars, but we could be looking at more traps. Watch where you step. If it looks suspicious, it probably is." A quiet ripple of unease traveled through the deputies, but there was no time for hesitation. Garrett gave the signal, and the teams moved in. The convoy crept down the long dirt road toward the warehouse, headlights cutting swaths of illumination through the endless darkness. Around the bend, the structure came into view, a looming mass of rust and decay, but undeniably alive with activity. Tiny pinpricks of light flickered through the grimy windows, and shadowy figures moved against the faint glow coming from inside. The first SWAT truck rolled to a silent stop, its heavily armored occupants unloading with precision, their boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. Garrett, Barnes, and Reynolds followed closely, staying low as they approached the perimeter. "Perimeter secured," whispered a voice in Garrett's earpiece. "No sign of patrols." "They're inside," Reynolds said quietly. "Stay sharp." The team split up, each assigned a specific entry point. Garrett's team was tasked with breaching the eastern side of the building, the vehicle bay. Already he could see rows of old trucks and sedans parked haphazardly in the shadows, their hoods propped open like corpses on operating tables. But just as Garrett stepped out of cover to signal his team forward, the silence shattered. A gunshot cracked through the night, followed by a dozen more. Muzzle flashes lit up the warehouse windows as alarms blared overhead. "They've spotted us!" Reynolds shouted, immediately bolting for cover behind a rusted crate. "Move! Move!" The ambush came fast and hard. Night hunters poured out of the warehouse like hornets defending their nest, their firepower far heavier than expected. Automatic rifles chattered, peppering the convoy vehicles with holes. Garrett hit the ground hard, his ears ringing as bullets whizzed past. "Return fire! Push forward!" Deputy Barnes moved with surprising speed, ducking low as she unleashed suppressing fire into the upper windows. "They're dug in deep, Sheriff! We need heavier firepower!" Reynolds, crouched beside an overturned barrel, reached for his radio. "Bring up the battering ram! We're not getting in through the side! Focus on the main entry!" More SWAT vehicles roared forward, their mounted floodlights blinding the shooters in the windows. Garrett's heart pounded as he scrambled to adjust his position, pulling a stunned rookie deputy behind cover just before another hail of bullets rained down. "Stick with me, kid," Garrett growled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This ain't training anymore." The tide turned when the battering ram made contact. The SWAT team's armored truck slammed into the main warehouse doors with deafening force, sending them careening inward. Smoke grenades followed, filling the air with an acrid haze as the assault teams surged inside under cover fire. Inside, chaos reigned. Night hunters fought like cornered animals, firing wildly from behind barricades of stacked tires and engine parts. But the law's forces were too many, too well organized. Garrett stormed into the vehicle bay, his shotgun leading the way. He caught a glimpse of one hunter trying to scramble into an old truck. He didn't hesitate. The blast of the shotgun sent the man sprawling, his weapon clattering to the floor. "Clear this area," Garrett barked, moving deeper into the bay. Barnes followed close behind, her weapon sweeping for targets. "We've got movement! Far side, toward the office!" From the corner of his eye, Garrett saw him. Larry Cole. The man moved like a predator, his graying ponytail whipping behind him as he sprinted toward a set of stairs leading to a catwalk. His pistol barked twice, forcing Garrett to dive behind a stack of tires. "Cole's heading upstairs," Garrett shouted into his radio. "Cut him off!" Reynolds and a team of SWAT officers surged toward the other end of the catwalk, trapping Larry in a deadly pincer. But the man didn't surrender. Instead, he turned and fired, hitting one officer in the leg and sending the others ducking for cover. Garrett climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his shotgun pumping once more. "Cole!" he bellowed. "It's over! Drop the weapon!" Larry turned, a wicked grin splitting his face. "You think you're stopping me, Sheriff? You're just the next name on my list." But before he could fire, Barnes appeared from below, her assault rifle trained on him. "Don't move, Cole!" The moment of hesitation was all Garrett needed. With a lunging tackle, he slammed Larry to the ground, forcing the gun from his hand. The two men struggled briefly, but Larry's age betrayed him. A pair of handcuffs snapped into place, and it was over. "Gotcha," Garrett growled, his chest heaving. The raid left several night hunters dead, dozens more in custody, and their entire operation in ruins. As dawn broke over Black Oak, an eerie calm settled over the warehouse, now swarming with law enforcement. Garrett stood near the edge of the scene, watching as SWAT officers hauled Larry Cole into a waiting van. For the first time in years, he let himself feel the faintest glimmer of relief. "It's not over," Reynolds said quietly, stepping up beside him. "Guys like Larry don't just quit. He's got more out there, I guarantee it." Garrett nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We'll deal with them when the time comes. For now, we've cut the head off the snake." The tumultuous trials. The raid on the night hunters' stronghold was only the beginning. What followed was a legal drama that captivated the nation, drawing attention from every major news network. For a small town like Elmswood and the surrounding counties, the courtroom became its own violent battleground, this time for the truth. The night hunters weren't just criminals. They were symbols of everything dark and broken in America's forgotten highways. And now, they were being dragged into the light. The trials began 6 months after Larry Cole's capture. The judicial proceedings unfolded in a cavernous federal courtroom in Atlanta, Georgia, where the stakes were more than just prison sentences. They were about justice for families who had spent years wondering where their loved ones vanished, only to find themselves torn apart by the answers. Sheriff Garrett Wilkes sat silently in the gallery on the first day, his usual toughened exterior barely masking the weight of everything riding on these trials. Despite months of preparation, the trial of the night hunters seemed stacked with complexities. Decades of jurisdictional gaps, missing evidence, reluctant witnesses, and the gang's carefully cultivated network of fear. Their leader, Larry Cole, sat calm and unmoving at the defense table, his shackled hands resting lightly on the surface like he owned it. His cold, calculating eyes scanned the courtroom, absorbing every detail with the precision of a hawk. The prosecutor, Helen Draper, was known for her unforgiving approach to high-profile cases. A woman in her late 40s with sharp features and a voice as cutting as her courtroom arguments, Draper wasted no time dismantling the mystique surrounding the night hunters. "This is not a trial about petty theft or juvenile delinquency," Draper began on the first day of opening arguments, her voice echoing in the silent chamber. "This is about a meticulously organized group of predators, a modern-day death cult, who used America's roads as their hunting grounds." She pointed directly at Larry. "And at the center of it all is him, Lawrence Larry Cole, a man who twisted his military training into a weapon of terror, leading a gang of human jackals to prey on the innocent. Larry smirked slightly at the attention, unimpressed by Draper's theatrics, but Garrett saw it for what it was. Larry liked the challenge. He thrived on it. His smirk wasn't confidence. It was a predator's patience. The witnesses. The courtroom erupted with revelations as the trial moved forward. Survivors like Marcus Lane and Agent Paul Reynolds were among the first to testify, detailing harrowing encounters with the Night Hunters. Marcus, his arm still showing scars from the crowbar attack, recounted his near-death experience, his voice shaky but resolute. "I was just a trucker," he said, his words hanging heavily in the air. "I thought I was helping some poor girl stranded in the rain. Turns out I was stepping into a trap. They didn't care who I was. They just wanted my truck. And my life." He paused, glancing briefly at Larry before continuing. "I'll never forget the way she looked at me, the bait girl, like I was already dead and she was just waiting for the dogs to finish tearing me apart." The bait girls themselves became a central point of debate during the trial. Several of them had been arrested in the raid, and their testimonies painted a picture of manipulation, coercion, and outright fear. One of them, a young woman named Natalie Hayes, was barely 22 and looked even younger. She sat on the stand, trembling as she recounted her recruitment into the gang. "Larry found me when I was 17, she whispered, tears spilling over as the words tumbled out. "He promised me work, money to take care of my mom, but that's not what he wanted. He wanted me to lure people, men, drivers, into his traps. And if I didn't," she glanced at Larry, her voice cracking, "if I didn't, he said I'd end up like Lena." There was a ripple of murmurs in the courtroom. Draper leaned forward. "Lena? You mean Lena Arlo, the girl found in Little Willow Creek? The first victim we tied to the Night Hunters?" Natalie nodded weakly. "She tried to run. She said she couldn't do it anymore, couldn't live with the blood on her hands. Larry made an example of her. He said, 'If you don't follow orders, you're just another disposable pawn.'" Her words ignited a firestorm in the courtroom, humanizing the gang's victims and showing another layer to Larry's ruthlessness. The judge called for order multiple times as spectators visibly squirmed in their seats. For Garrett, it was the first time he felt anger replace the exhaustion that had consumed him since this nightmare began. Lena wasn't just another victim, she'd been their warning to one another. Larry's stare-down Larry Cole remained calm through every damning testimony. Draper laid out mountains of evidence against him, including the warehouse full of stolen vehicles, the GPS tracks, and even scraps of his military history that cemented his ability to engineer their deadly traps. And yet, Larry never once faltered, his cold eyes following every word like a hunter patiently watching his prey tire itself out. When it was his turn to speak, Larry rose slowly, his shackles clinking faintly in the silent courtroom. His legal team, clearly hired by some last-ditch reserves of Night Hunter money, had prepared a defense equal parts defiance and manipulation. Larry played the patriot, referring back to his military record and claiming that the government had abandoned him after using him as a tool for their wars. "I gave everything to this country," Larry said smoothly, his voice steady, almost sympathetic. "And when I came home, there wasn't any welcome back parade, there wasn't any support. They stuffed a medal in my hand and threw me to the wolves, so yeah, I made my own way. And if some people got hurt along the way, maybe they should have thought twice about stopping on roads that didn't belong to them." The courtroom exploded at his cold admission. Garrett tightened his fists, his nails digging into his palms as Larry's chilling words reverberated in his mind. The verdict. The trial dragged on for months, stretching every ounce of emotional endurance from victims, survivors, and the prosecution. But when the verdict arrived, it hit with the weight of justice long overdue. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Lawrence Cole, guilty on all counts including murder in the first degree." The cheer that erupted from the gallery was almost animalistic in its relief. People hugged each other, tears in their eyes as they finally felt the closure they'd been denied for so long. Larry Cole was sentenced to death by lethal injection, but even as the sentence was read, he smirked. "You can't kill a ghost," Larry muttered as officers led him away, a cold grin etched across his face. Garrett heard it clearly, his jaw tightening as he watched Larry disappear out the door. Lingering shadows. The Night Hunters' trials didn't end with Larry's verdict. Dozens of low-level members faced charges, though some managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system. The bait girls, like Natalie Hayes, were offered plea deals in exchange for their testimony, sparking debates about whether the system had truly delivered justice. And though the Night Hunters' reign had been shattered, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that some remnants of their operation were still out there, waiting, watching. Justice doesn't feel as clean as I thought it would, Garrett admitted to Barnes as they left the courthouse that final day. Because it's not, Barnes replied, adjusting the badge pinned to her chest. But at least it's a start. A half-finished justice. The courtroom verdict against Lawrence Larry Cole and his night hunters brought relief to many, but it didn't bring resolution. For those who had lost loved ones or barely survived encounters with the gang, the word justice felt strangely hollow. The trials may have toppled the violent empire Larry had created, but justice wasn't served with the same brutal precision that the night hunters had inflicted on their victims. Loose ends hung like fog over the case, a lingering reminder that no victory is ever truly clean. The missing and the unaccounted for. In the weeks following the sentencing of Larry Cole, Sheriff Garrett Wilkes sat in his modest office in Elmswood, flipping through a binder filled with case files. Each page listed a name, a profile picture, and the heartbreaking details of a disappearance tied to rural southern highways. Many of these people had never been found, their fates known only to the walls of the rotting warehouses and dirt-covered back roads that Larry and his gang had controlled. "How many are still missing?" Deputy Ellie Barnes asked, walking into the room with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Garrett looked up, his face weathered and drawn after weeks of facing reporters, families, and his own frustration. 15, he said after a long pause. 15 names we still can't account for. And that's not counting the ones we'll never know about, the ones who weren't reported missing because they didn't have anyone left to miss them. Barnes shook her head, leaning against the doorframe. "We got Cole. He's on death row. Most of his crew's locked up or running scared. That's something, isn't it?" "It's something, but it's not enough," Garrett growled, flipping the binder closed with a heavy thud. "Those families out there, they don't get closure just because we put a needle in Cole's arm. They don't get their sons or daughters or wives or husbands back. Hell, some of them don't even have a body to bury." Barnes sighed, swirling her coffee. "You really think there are more of them out there? Hunters, I mean." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "I don't think it, I know it." The night hunter's legacy. For Garrett, the trial wasn't the clean cut he'd hoped for. While Larry Cole sat rotting in solitary confinement and many of his key enforcers faced long prison terms, the true depth of the night hunters' network remained a mystery. Across state lines, whispers of other factions began to emerge, small groups spreading like splinters from the original operation. The hunters' methods, their insidious traps on rural roads, had become more than just a criminal tactic. They were a legacy. Months after the final trial, Garrett received a call from a frustrated sheriff 2 states over in Mississippi. Another trucker had gone missing on a lonely highway, and the scene bore eerie similarities to the hunter's old playbook. Same makeshift trap, same signs of violence, same hollow stretch of empty road swallowed by darkness. "Thought y'all took care of these bastards," the Mississippi sheriff spat over the line. "We took down the head," Garrett replied grimly, "but the body's still kicking." The disturbing truth was that Larry might have been the leader, but he wasn't the entire problem. The night hunters didn't function like a traditional gang. They had become an idea, a method of preying on the vulnerable that could outlast any one man. And in the shadows of truck stops and gas stations along the endless southern highways, someone somewhere was still following Larry's example. The bait girls, victims or criminals. One of the most polarizing aspects of the trials, and the media frenzy surrounding them, was the public debate over the role of the bait girls. Many of these women, like Natalie Hayes, were eventually offered plea deals in exchange for their testimonies, but not everyone agreed with those decisions. To some, they were accomplices just as guilty as the men they helped lure unsuspecting victims to. To others, they were victims in their own right, manipulated and coerced by a man who thrived on fear and control. In an interview shortly after the trials, Natalie Hayes recounted her years under Larry's thumb. Though her voice trembled, there was a defiance in her words, as though she refused to be reduced to the black and white labels of victim or perpetrator. "I didn't want to do any of it," she said, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "But when you're 17, broke and scared for your life, do you always get to choose? Larry, he wasn't just a leader, he was like a god. He decided who ate, who got punished, who lived, and who didn't." Her testimony was a stark reminder that the night hunters thrived not just on physical violence, but on psychological domination. Yet her words left lingering doubts in the minds of families who had lost loved ones. Garrett heard those grievances every time he walked into a diner or a hardware store in Elmswood. "If those girls hadn't waved their arms or cried their crocodile tears," one man spat, "my brother'd still be alive." The sheriff didn't have the heart to argue. but he wasn't sure of the answer himself. Could they hold the Bait Girls fully accountable for the suffering they helped cause? Or were they just as trapped as anyone else who had encountered Larry Cole? Larry Cole, the unrepentant ghost. Though he was sentenced to death, Larry seemed to welcome the punishment rather than fear it. Locked in the unrelenting monotony of death row, he refused interviews and wrote no letters, but his influence still reached far beyond the prison walls. Garrett couldn't help but feel haunted by the last thing Larry said as he was dragged out of the courtroom. "You can't kill a ghost." It was a taunt, plain and simple, but there was a chilling truth to those words. Larry Cole may have been trapped inside a cell, but the terror he created still lingered like a specter. The law could bring justice to individuals, but it couldn't erase the fear, the paranoia, and the long shadows Larry had cast over the southern highways. Every time a ghost trucker hit the road, those nomadic drivers who never stay anywhere too long, they carried stories of roadside traps and the notorious hunters. It was folklore now, and folklore, Garrett knew, had a way of keeping its villains alive. The sheriff's burden. Months turned to years, and the sting of the night hunter's terror started to fade. But Garrett Wilkes never stopped looking over his shoulder. Each cold case, each pattern that hinted at more hunters out there, kept him awake at night. Even as the Elmswood Sheriff's Department moved back to its routine of ticketing speeders and handling bar fights, Garrett kept the binder of unsolved cases on his desk. "They always want closure," he once told Barnes as she caught him thumbing through the pages late one rainy evening. "But I've been doing this long enough to know there's no such thing. You don't get closure, you just get more questions that hurt less over time." Barnes tilted her head, watching her aging boss as he stared down the endless ocean of names and faces. "Do you think they'll ever find all of them, every last hunter?" Garrett smiled faintly, but it was a sad smile. "I don't know, Ellie, I really don't." In his heart, Garrett knew the job wasn't done. It might never be done, but for victims like Marcus Lane, for families who'd buried empty caskets, and for all the names still left unanswered on his list, Garrett knew one thing for sure: he was never going to stop trying. Elmswood Shadow's justice for the night hunters may have been half finished, but it was a start, and sometimes, in the chaos of a broken world, a start is all you can hope for. The dark legacy and lessons for the present. The story of the night hunters became a haunting chapter in American history, a grim reminder of the cruel and violent underbelly of the country's highways. Long after the courtroom verdicts and the dismantling of Larry Cole's empire, the horrors of his reign lingered, not just in the memories of the survivors, but in the very fabric of the communities that had suffered under his shadow. This wasn't just a story about crime. It was a story about an unraveling America, a landscape of broken people, forgotten roads, and systems ill-equipped to stop men like Larry Cole from rising to power. It was a story that forced towns like Elmswood, and the entire country, to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, fear, and the fragility of security. For Garrett Wilkes, those truths were more than just philosophical ponderings. They were wounds that might never heal. The empty highways. If you drove along Route 17 or the winding backroads of Georgia, Alabama, or Mississippi, you might not know the horrors those highways had witnessed. The grass along the shoulders had grown back. The rusting hulks of abandoned vehicles had been towed away, sold for scrap or forgotten in junkyards. The markers of tragedy were erased, but the scars bled invisibly into the folklore of truck stops and sleepy backwater towns. For years after the trials, truckers and night travelers swapped stories over bad coffee and greasy meals. "You ever hear about the night hunters?" one would say, leaning forward as if afraid the murderer's ghost might be listening. "They used to set traps out there. Fake breakdowns, accidents, crying women by the road. They'd snag you before you even realized it, strip your car down, and you'd vanish, poof, like you were never there." "How'd they catch 'em?" a newbie might ask. "They caught their leader, Larry Cole, some crazy ex-army dude. Took forever to bring him down, though. You can thank lawmen like that Wilkes fella, small-town sheriff with steel in his spine, but makes you wonder." The speaker would trail off, glancing out at the dark highway beyond the diner's windows. "You think they got all of them? Or maybe some of them are still out there?" And that was the thing about Larry Cole and what he'd built. Even in death row isolation, even as his name faded from headlines, the fear he created didn't just stop. It became something else, a ghost story, one that made people think twice about stopping on lonely roads or trusting an outstretched hand. Broken systems, invisible people. Behind the crimes of Larry Cole and the night hunters lay a larger, grimmer reality. Garrett Wilkes often found himself thinking about it as he drove the empty roads late at night, headlights slicing through the dark. Larry's gang wasn't built on money or loyalty, it was built on desperation. Bait girls like Natalie Hayes weren't hardened criminals, they were kids at the end of their rope. The enforcers who wielded crowbars and guns weren't masterminds, they were lost men, crushed by addiction, poverty, and hopelessness. And at the center of it all was Larry Cole, a man who saw people as tools to be sharpened and broken. America loved to talk about justice and good triumphing over evil, but the truth felt messier. The night hunters thrived because the world around them was frayed and bleeding. Small towns with too few jobs, families stretched thin, veterans abandoned by the country they'd fought to protect. It was the perfect storm, and men like Larry knew how to exploit it. "Do you ever wonder if we're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem?" Barnes asked one night as she leaned against the hood of Garrett's patrol car. They were parked on the edge of Little Willow Creek, the spot where it all began. Garrett nodded but didn't say anything at first. Instead he stared out at the water, the moonlight casting faint ripples across the surface. "We stopped him," he said finally. His voice was rough, tired. "We stopped them, that's something." "But," Barnes pressed. Garrett exhaled slowly, the words coming out like a painful confession. "But there's always going to be another Larry Cole. There's always going to be someone who figures out how to break people, how to twist desperation into power. And when it happens again, we'll be playing catch-up, just like we did this time." Lessons for the future. If there was one thing the case of the Night Hunters taught Garrett Wilkes, it was that evil doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It grows, slowly, quietly, in the cracks people choose to ignore. Poverty, addiction, abandoned communities, broken veterans, forgotten highways. These weren't just problems for some far-off city council or federal agency. They were rot, and if left unchecked, that rot gave men like Larry Cole everything they needed to flourish. But recognizing the problem wasn't the same as fixing it. "The system's broken," Reynolds, the FBI agent, said to Garrett one day as they sat outside the courthouse in Atlanta, a pair of worn men both holding cold cups of bad coffee. "Always has been." "Maybe," Garrett replied, staring into the swirling steam rising from his cup. "But that doesn't mean you stop trying to patch it up." Reynolds chuckled, though it didn't come with much humor. "You sure about that? Feels like for every one Larry Cole we take down, there's 10 more waiting to pop up." Garrett glanced at him, his voice steady, filled with the kind of quiet certainty that had kept him going through years of dark nights. "Yeah, I'm sure, because as long as I'm around I can at least make sure these roads don't belong to the next bastard who thinks he's king of the hill." The ghost of Larry Cole. For many in Elmswood, the Night Hunters were a chapter of the town's history best forgotten, and yet, no one could shake the feeling that Larry Cole's presence still loomed. It wasn't just his crimes, it was the chilling way he carried himself, his unflinching belief that the world was his to dominate, his cold final words as he was dragged out of the courtroom, "You can't kill a ghost." To many, Larry was right. He wasn't just a man, he had become a legend, a specter haunting the spaces where law and chaos met. His dark charisma, his ruthless methodology, his bone-chilling ability to twist the vulnerable into weapons, all of it lived on, not just in stories, but in the cracks of a society too weary and too fractured to fully heal. Garrett's promise. On quiet nights in Elmswood, Garrett still drove the same roads he had been patrolling for decades. The binder of missing persons never left his desk, its pages a silent promise to the families he couldn't fully comfort. "Do you ever think about giving this up?" Barnes asked one night as they parked outside a gas station drenched in fluorescent light. "Every damn day," Garrett admitted, his hands resting loosely on the wheel. "But then I think about all the people nobody else is looking out for. Those truckers. The kids who get caught up with someone like Larry. The families who never get answers." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I can't leave them to the wolves." And so, Garrett drove on, his presence a quiet guardian of those forgotten highways, one small piece of resistance against the dark forces that might rise again. He couldn't fix everything, he couldn't stop the rot by himself. But he could keep fighting, because on those roads, shadowed by the lives that had been lost and the stories that would never fully fade, the fight wasn't just about justice. It was about keeping hope alive, no matter how broken it might seem. Legacy roads. The story of Larry Cole and the Night Hunters wasn't just a cautionary tale about crime. It was a lesson, a painful, bloody lesson, about vigilance, compassion, and the cost of looking the other way. For Sheriff Garrett Wilkes, those lessons were carved into every mile of highway, every cold case that remained unsolved, every family he had to look in the eye and tell, "We're still looking." Because if nothing else, what happened on those dark, lonely roads proved one thing: when you ignore the cracks, something dangerous grows to fill them.